Four gang members sit in their car, inhaling illegal substances while waiting for their next target. One of them reassures the others that their next mark is making money every day. We then see a girl exiting a building to deposit cash at the bank. The thugs become alert, don rabbit masks, and begin following the girl's car. Eventually, they intercept her at the end of the road and drag her out of the vehicle. One of the gang members searches the car for money but finds nothing. Suddenly, an old couple, George and Sandra, happens to be driving by and immediately stops at the scene. The thugs demand that George leave, one of them hitting him with a baseball bat. However, George manages to punch the attacker, smashing his head open. He then turns to face the others, demanding they leave. One member brandishes a knife, threatening George, but as they hear the sound of approaching sirens, they flee the scene. The police arrive shortly after. In his statement, George tells the officers that he was only trying to stop the thug, not kill him. Chief Inspector Holland, with a hint of sarcasm, responds,
"So yeah, what he should have thought after he started swinging."
He then arrests George on suspicion of manslaughter. Later that day, the remaining three thugs approach their boss, Warren, informing him that the robbery didn't go as planned. When Warren inquires about his brother, he's shocked to learn of his death. Enraged by the loss of his brother, Warren orders the thugs not to return until George is ended. After George is released on bail and returns home, the thugs, including Warren, follow him and knock on his door, while the other two circle around to the back of the house. One of them mentions his intent to assault George's wife. George is pinned against the wall with a knife in his mouth as the thug who earlier threatened him with the knife sneers that he shouldn't have played the hero that day. The thugs then tie the couple to chairs in the garage and douse them with gasoline. As the couple sobs in fear, Warren ignites the room, burning them alive. In the next scene, we see a plane touching down on the runway. The scene then shifts to a car, where the story's protagonist, Jimmy Vickers, a special operations interrogation officer, is listening to an old message from his mother. She talks about looking forward to seeing him soon and hopes for his safe return. The man appears to be in deep distress as he heads home. Once home, he listens to another voicemail from his friend Griffin, who offers words of comfort and expresses sorrow over the tragic loss of Jimmy's loved ones. This plunges Jimmy into even greater despair. Jimmy heads to a bar. There, he questions the owners Debs and Terry about the incident. Terry denies having any information, so Jimmy points out that Terry lives just 50 yards away from his parents' house, close enough to have heard their screams. Terry seems irritated by this and warns Jimmy to leave if he's there to cause trouble. Frustrated and angry over what has happened, Jimmy grabs Terry by the collar and gets into a scuffle. Debs intervenes and urges Terry to tell Jimmy what he knows. Finally, Terry tells Jimmy that he called the fire department that night and reveals that he saw 4 gang members. They broke into the house, and he heard Jimmy's father screaming, but out of fear, he didn't intervene and only watched from his window. The events are piling up, and later, we see Jimmy in the burned-down garage of his parents' house. Jimmy's police friend, Griffin, informs him that a neighbor saw a black BMW speeding through the area at 11 p.m. that night, but they never got a chance to see the license plate. Griffin believes it's highly likely that the gang that had a conflict with George is responsible for his murder, but the police don't have any evidence. After instructing Griffin to send him the CCTV footage from the robbery, Jimmy leaves the garage with tears in his eyes. The next morning, Jimmy pays his respects at his parents' graves. While at the church, his wife Morgan shows up. Here, we learn that Morgan and Jimmy were on the brink of divorce before this tragedy occurred. Morgan mentions that she sent him 5 letters, but he still missed the funeral. However, realizing that Jimmy is going through a tough time, she comforts him, saying that he doesn't have to be alone and that he can come over to her place whenever he's ready. The next day, Griffin arranges a meeting with Jimmy and informs him that the black BMW belongs to Warren, who, according to the investigation, is the brother of the man George accidentally killed that day. He then hands Jimmy the CCTV footage of the robbery. That evening, as Warren leaves the gym, his car is rammed from behind. He gets out, only to find Jimmy waiting in the car behind him, ready to confront him. Jimmy, a special forces operative, easily overpowers Warren. When Warren regains consciousness, he finds himself tied to the front seat, drenched in gasoline by Jimmy. Jimmy reminds him of the elderly couple he murdered 2 weeks ago. Warren, enraged, insists he did the right thing and shows no remorse for his actions. Instead, he taunts Jimmy by explaining how he assaulted Jimmy's mother that night. Keeping his emotions in check, Jimmy forces Warren to hand over the names of his gang members, promising to let him go in return. After Warren writes down the names, Jimmy lights a cigarette. Later, he heads to Morgan's house, but due to his injuries, he struggles to speak. When he gets up, Morgan realizes something is wrong. Noticing the blood on his shirt, she takes him inside, where she stitches up his wounds. Despite the couple being on the verge of divorce, this event brings them closer, leading Jimmy to spend the night at Morgan's house. The next day, Warren's death makes headlines, but everyone knows about his drug-dealing career and criminal background. When one of the thugs, Rob, learns about the incident, he and Leon rush to confront Warren's business partner, Caleb, believing that Caleb might have killed Warren over a dispute regarding their percentage share. They knock on his door and confront him, but Caleb has no idea what they're talking about. After being rescued by his girlfriend, Caleb denies the accusations and warns Rob and Leon not to return to his neighborhood. That evening, Griffin visits Jimmy and advises him against taking the law into his own hands. But unlike Griffin, Jimmy believes that the corrupt system will never stop these thugs, who have almost every family in town under their influence. They only take statements and process them, while the criminals mock them and spit in their faces. Griffin then arrives at a crime scene where a man has been murdered during an armed robbery. Here, Griffin finally realizes the flaws in the police department as DCI Holland dismisses the armed robbery and the victim, blatantly stating that the shopkeeper shouldn't have retaliated. When Griffin, visibly upset, argues that the man was protecting his livelihood, Holland tells him to take a cold medicine. According to Holland, the man's wife will file for insurance and get a hefty payout, and everyone will be happy. Meanwhile, Jimmy continues his hunt and targets the next gang member, Ryan. He takes him to an abandoned place, ties him to a chair, and clamps his mouth shut. Knowing the various tortures that any Special Forces interrogator would employ, Jimmy begins his pursuit of revenge. He pours cement into Ryan's mouth, forcing him to swallow and suffocate to death. The next day, the police discover Ryan's body, solidified from head to toe in cement. DCI Holland shows keen interest, thinking this might give him a decent promotion. Later, bar owner Terry shows Holland CCTV footage from his bar, where they can see Jimmy dragging an unconscious guy into the back seat of his car. Despite Debs advising him not to reveal the footage, Terry doesn't want his bar to end up like George's house, burned to the ground. The police then question Morgan about Jimmy, and she lies while Jimmy hides in her apartment. Later, at a marketplace, 2 police officers start tailing Jimmy. Just as they're about to arrest him, a car suddenly pulls up. 2 burly men get out and assault the officers, allowing Jimmy to escape with them. At this moment, Jimmy is shocked to see Colonel Leach emerge from the car. Since Jimmy is a valuable asset to the Special Forces, the colonel has come to personally bring him back. He gives Jimmy 48 hours to clean up his mess, which means he needs to eliminate the remaining gang members before he must return to duty. On the other hand, Griffin approaches his colleague, SWAT team leader Joe, and tells him that this case shouldn't be taken lightly. Joe, sensing something suspicious, asks Griffin if he knows the killer. Griffin then reveals the truth. He's a friend of Jimmy's, and Jimmy's parents were brutally murdered. Although Joe still believes Jimmy has gone rogue, Griffin argues that Holland isn't any better. He's just taking the case seriously to become a superintendent, which might destroy the department due to his corruption and negligence. Meanwhile, Jimmy begins his revenge, knowing he has the Army's backing and won't be caught. While Leon is sitting in a strip club, he receives an envelope containing photos of the deceased Ryan. Sensing danger, the thug flees the club, only to be run over by Jimmy. When Leon regains consciousness, he finds himself trapped with his lower body tied to a gate and his upper body chained to a car. Leon, clueless as to why he's being tortured, only angers Jimmy further. As a result, Jimmy shows no mercy. He gets into the car and drives at full speed, ripping Leon's body in half. The next day, Colonel Leach meets DCI Holland in a restaurant. He demands that Holland hand over everything the police have on Jimmy, asserting that Jimmy belongs to the military, not him. Hearing this, Holland refuses, saying that if the colonel were in charge of the law, he should be locked up. Colonel Leach then explains Jimmy's bravery by recalling an incident from 2009. He says that the military captured a terrorist planning a major attack on the UK mainland, but the terrorist refused to divulge any information. However, after just 10 minutes alone with Jimmy, the terrorist spilled everything. He said that people like Jimmy aren't afraid of death. They welcome it. Finally, he warns that Jimmy will eliminate these guys and then disappear without a trace. DCI Holland accepts the challenge and declares that he will find Jimmy. The colonel leaves, warning Holland that if he dares touch Jimmy, he'll face the colonel's wrath. In the next scene, we see the superintendent and police chief meeting with the head of the army in a brief session. The head of the army bluntly states that Jimmy, the subject of the ongoing investigation, should not be detained under any circumstances. Without revealing too much about Jimmy, the officers inform the superiors that Jimmy is crucial to Britain's top-secret operations. The military high command demands that the police report directly to them on the progress of this investigation. Later that night, the last remaining member of the gang, Rob, who was part of the group that killed Jimmy's parents, is brought outside by some drug dealers. Jimmy uses him as a shield, forcing him to knock on the door, though Rob eventually manages to escape. Jimmy kills all the remaining drug dealers except for Warren's business partner, Caleb. Jimmy ties Caleb to a chair and begins mixing some chemicals in a barrel, the same type of chemicals the dealers use to make their drugs. Then Jimmy starts dissolving all the cash in the barrel before pouring the corrosive liquid over Caleb's head, melting him alive. Meanwhile, DCI Holland realizes that Officer Griffin has been feeding Jimmy information from the start, so he presses him about who Jimmy's next target might be. However, Griffin refuses to tell him and demands that Holland stay away from Jimmy. But Holland seems unwilling to let Jimmy go and defies his superior's orders. Holland then tracks down the last gang member, who had escaped from the hospital the night before. In the next scene, the limping man is seen rifling through some letters in Jimmy's apartment. Moments later, Jimmy catches up with him and forces him to drive to the harbor. He makes the guy kneel down, hands bound, and pulls out a syringe, claiming it's the most dangerous aerosol spray that will burn someone from the inside out. Rob spits at Jimmy and tells him to check the trunk of his car. To Jimmy's shock, it turns out that Rob has killed Morgan before Jimmy could kill him. When the SWAT team escorted by Holland arrives at the scene, Jimmy, in disbelief and exhausted, empties the clip of his gun into Rob. Griffin also arrives and confronts Holland about letting Rob out of the hospital, which led to Morgan's death. Holland says he released him so that the guy could lead them to Jimmy, but he didn't know he would kill Jimmy's wife. Seeing the reality of the situation, SWAT team leader Joe orders his squad to stand down, much to Holland's shock. They allow the wounded Jimmy to leave the scene while Holland tries to stop him alone. Before leaving the area, Jimmy punches Holland in the face, finally stopping him in his tracks. The movie ends in a narrow alley where a random girl is taking out the trash. As she screams for help, two strangers corner and grab her. At the other end of the alley, Jimmy appears. The thugs confront Jimmy, demanding that he leave, but the screen goes black as Jimmy flashes a sinister smile.